Hi, Eric. Welcome to the show.
Thanks, John. Nice to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Oh, it's my pleasure. We had quite an interesting pre-chat. There's a lot of similarities between you and I. We're going to cover your latest book, Rock and Rolled. But before we do that, why don't you tell us a little bit about who you are, where you live, and what do you do, and how long you've been writing, and what motivates you?
Okay, thanks a lot. I appreciate being here, John. I've seen others of your podcasts, and I really have I've enjoyed listening to you do your interviewing. I think you're an excellent interviewer. Let me tell you a little bit about myself as you've requested. I'm Eric J. Sonnenschein. I live in New York. I've actually lived on the same street in New York for quite a few years, which is interesting because when I was much younger, I thought of myself as a very peripatetic individual. I was in the Peace Corps. I spent a year abroad when I was a student, and I had every intention of being nomadic. As a matter of fact, my first two novels, Ad Nomad and Mad Nomad, kind of go into that aspect of my personality. But I have been rather sedentary because at a certain point in my youth, when I was a young man, I decided that the most important thing to me was to be a writer, and I wanted that more than to be a world traveler. So I decided I was gonna take my stand in New York and just write and do everything I could to write. From the time I was a little boy, I guess I kind of had, there were intimations that I was going to be a writer. For one thing, my parents used to play a card game with me, a little bit like Rummy, called Authors. And this game of authors had a number of very famous authors, Melville, Mark Twain, Dickens, Shakespeare. And you had to match their four most famous books. And if you matched them, you won the game, I suppose. And so I started becoming sensitized to authors, thinking, oh, as a little boy, these were important people. Then, in fourth, fifth grade, I was about 10, 11 years old during the summer. I was bored, so I would pick up my first Shakespeare. Read The Tempest. I started reading David Copperfield and Oliver Twist and these Dickens books. And then, of course, I moved on. During biology class, I remember I made myself very sick by reading Hemingway's Farewell to Arms, the terrible, wrenching a birth scene where she's hemorrhaging and everything. And while this was going on, there was a movie on where blood was spurting at the camera, and so it was about our circulatory system, I guess. And so I was reading the book. I was reading this terrible scene and then looking up at blood spurting against the camera, the hemorrhage on the page, the blood spurting on the camera. And it was kind of a funny, but that's how I was. I was always stealing time and energy to read novelists and to write myself. And I received a lot of uh, early acclaim as a writer. My poetry was published in the Washington Star when I was a high school senior. I won different awards and so on. But then, of course, I hit the real world, and it seemed to me that people were willing to pay me to do just about anything but what I wanted to do and what I felt I was best at.
Isn't that the case? Yeah.
Oh yeah,
Yeah.
selling instead of writing for the newspaper, they wanted me to sell ad space for a newspaper.
Yeah.
And unlike, you seem to be a very people-oriented person. I was never very good at selling, at just like, going up to people, sidling up to them and, giving them the talk and, for some reason it just wasn't my personality. I'm a voluble person. I'm a discursive. I'm garrulous, but not particularly gregarious. You know
Sure.
if your listeners get that distinction.
Mm.
So I had a hard time, and gradually I moved my way into advertising, which was a way of sort of. Well, before that, I was teaching. I was teaching writing, teaching English, teaching American studies as a day job to write because I gave me a lot more free time. And then that I didn't, wasn't on tenure track, so I had to find a way of making a living. I found a way making a living by doing advertising. And of course, in advertising, the funny thing is they want you to be creative. That's it. To get that kind of creative job, you have to really sweat bullets. But once you're there, you're lucky if you write a great headline, they love the headline. You're lucky if one of the 10 words that you've written ever really gets in the final mix.
Yeah.
The creative director is changing a word, and then the client's changing 3 words, and then the regulatory people are changing 4 words, and you end up with your one word, which is probably an article like the and a,
Right.
that kind of thing. So, um, so I had to deal with that. Fortunately, I was like I was like the Israelites and the children of Israel in exile in Babylon. I was a creative, a writer in advertising, but I wasn't doing any of the writing that I had set out to do as a young man and
Right.
as a boy. And so, but at some point, as I was waiting for another round of changes to my copy to come to me late at night, somehow I started writing essays. Ideas came to me, and I had the time and I had the time and the energy, and I was bored enough, and I started writing essays, creative writing. And that's how I got back into it. So that was my way back. So now I guess I should get back to Rocked and Rolled. How did I write this book? Well, somewhere along the line in trying to figure out what my niche was in life, I had written songs when I was in the Peace Corps. They had come to me as again when I was riding on buses through the desert, melodies would pop into my head.
Yeah.
I came to New York and I started, I got tired of just writing books and sending them into publishing houses and getting no response. Why don't I do something more creative? Why don't I get my work in front of people? How do you do that? Go on stage and sing your songs. And so I got into music. And then,
Cool.
years later, after I was in and then out of music, I decided to write a book based on those experiences. And that's how we get to Rocked and Rolled.
Okay.
People will ask, well, is Rocked and Rolled, basically a thinly disguised roman à clef? Is it really a thinly disguised memoir? Well, it really isn't. I mean, I basically write from experience, but it's a novel. What is Rocked and Rolled about? Well, very basically, it's about the rock and roll scene in the late 70s and early 80s, which was the new wave / punk rock scene in downtown Manhattan. It was a kind of rowdy and boisterous and somewhat sordid scene. Um, it's about a cityscape and a way of life and neighborhoods that are no longer there. It's all been gentrified. It's all been changed. So that's things that you read about in Rocked and Roll will seem to be historical almost, and that's how I depict Rocked and Rolled. It's a historical comic novel based in the late 1970s, early 80s, New York. It follows the adventures and misadventures, the triumphs and the great many disappointments of a young man who's trying desperately to make it in the very competitive music industry. He goes through a lot to do that. In the process of doing it, he meets a lot of crazy characters who, like himself, are just inventing and reinventing themselves. And I guess the underlying theme of it, John, is you look at this guy, Trevor, and what he goes through to make music, and first of all, the siren song to make music. Why? What impels us to make music as human beings? Why do we do it? And then on a greater, I guess, on a deeper level, what makes us have to be creative? I mean, people are always, even in the book, one of his quote unquote benefactors in the music industry asked Trevor, why don't you become a lawyer? You're too smart to be in music. Why are you doing this? Why don't you become a computer programmer or something like that? I mean, people are always dangling these alternative, these B plans to him, these alternative career paths, and yet he cleaves, he clings to this dream of becoming a musician and a rock star and a creative individual. Why? Why do we do it? people are still doing it, I'm sure.
Now, I noticed that this is a fairly lengthy book. You've got it there. Let's take a look at it.
Yes, here it is. It's 400, circa 450 pages, but
Yeah.
the type is large because
Hmm.
I wanted to accommodate an audience that,
Okay.
like myself, is doesn't have the same 2015 or
Yeah.
2020 vision
Right.
we once had. So,
Why by that, what do you mean? Is it 14 or is it
oh no, it's 11. The
11?
typeface
Typeface
is
11?
11 inches, but
Okay.
it's quite. But
Okay.
the
All right.
leading, the
Yeah.
spacing is very good. It's very reader friendly in that
Right.
respect. Yeah, 450. I'm almost loath to tell you that it's the shortest one of my novels.
When did you start writing this book, and how long did it take for you to write it?
Well, I have to say, I wrote it in two different iterations. I wrote the first version in the late 90s, just before
Oh, really?
the world came crashing and I had to get a job in advertising.
That's right.
And then I decided to look at it again. They always tell you, especially agents and people like that, once you've written the first few or two or three drafts, put it in your drawer, your desk drawer, and then
Mhm.
look at it at some later time. And that's essentially what I did. And so this book it went through a number of iterations then, because I never just send out the first or second or third draft. I'm reasonably meticulous about what I present to some other reader to read. But this one has gone through many drafts since then. In fact, even since the beginning of this year, I subjected it to numerous readings and revisions.
Yes.
I really, to be honest, a lot of people ask me, John, do you ever like a lot of people who write about an experience like rocket and rolled or about biking or hiking up to the Adirondack, they'll write, do you ever miss those days? I mean, the writing for them seems like a trace, somebody trying to reconstruct something that
Okay.
was a peak moment or a
Yeah.
highlight of their life. For me, doing rock and roll was certainly intense and a peak moment, but to me, it's almost as if I did all of that. I did all the music, all the quote unquote research, the living research, so that I could write this book. Writing the book has been the peak for me, and doing it was the field work that went into writing the book.
Now, you mentioned Mad Nomad and Ad Nomad, and you said in the pre-chat that somehow they're not, well, necessarily connected to rock and roll, but sort of in the same vein. Is that it?
Yeah, in the sense that I'd like to think, John, that when it's all said and done, when Sartre says that when we're gone, when we finally give up the last breath, that there's a line written under our names, and that's it. We're never going to do anything else. Well, when that time happens, I would like to believe that there's a shelf of my work, and that everything that I've written to some extent reflects something from me, something that I experienced, something that I've thought about, whether it's in the form of essay, whether it's in the form of fiction, and that everything in some sense is a piece of me. And I think that you would probably agree with that. And to some extent, it really doesn't even matter. It's a little bit like trying to say, well, did Beethoven, and I don't want to compare myself to Beethoven, but I'm saying, did he care, or any of these composers, did he really value his string quartet more than Für Elise, or did he value his Moonlight Sonata less than his Emperor Concerto? And to some extent, I think these kinds of comparisons are invidious. Everything we create, whether it's a small thing or a large thing, whether it's a simple thing or a more complicated thing, they all speak from, if they're honest and they're of some value, they must speak from authentically about us, the creators. And so, yeah, I said that Ad Nomad and Mad Nomad were had some propinquity with rock and roll because they reflect an experience, a fictional extrapolation of something that I experienced. In Ad Nomad, it was about being in advertising. It was about being in pharmaceutical advertising specifically, and the incredible mind contortions, and the elation of somehow being in this cabal, in this kind of um, priesthood of, because the creatives in advertising, at least when you're on the outside, they treat themselves, they talk about themselves, and they talk about being a creative in advertising as if it were kind of um, a wonderful club to be in. And then once the people, if you happen to pass through those portals and become a member of that club, you experience it in a completely different way, as a kind of torture, as a kind of star chamber experience. But anyway, Mad Nomad was based on my experience in the Peace Corps. It was about a Peace Corps volunteer in North Africa, and what that was all, what that kind of experience would have been about, what it would be like to be a young American put into a situation where you're basically alone in a culture that is completely different, and sometimes antithetical to the one that you're from the standpoint of fatalism versus the American optimism about, you know, uh, being responsible for your own well-being and your
Hmm.
own
Yeah.
life. The kind of new American optimism and pragmatism, and versus, and then, Islam versus Judaism, Christianity, and a kind of secularism that
Hmm.
doesn't seem to care about, that's kind of turned Christmas into a consumer opportunity, and that's turned, religion into, something you do when you're in the morning, before you go and watch football in the afternoon, that type of thing.
Yeah.
And so, um, and then of course, the kind of romantic, it's kind of also a parody of the Lawrence of Arabia experience, the American, the Occidental, going into an Arab country and sort of in some ways assuming some of the characteristics of the culture that he's immersed in, usually for comic effect.
These three books may reflect parts of your life. Is there ample room for conflict, which of course makes stories interesting? And how do you work the conflict in there? Do you exaggerate them?
Oh yes. Well, in Ad Nomad, there was no reason to do that because I think what it really starts off with is that you have to have a protagonist who's entering a real situation with a preconceived idea that by its nature is not going to be in alignment with the reality that he's entering. I think my books probably are in the vein of Don Quixote in that respect. Don Quixote having been a man who was deceived, was deluded into believing that he could be a knight errant. He could become like the fictional heroes of the medieval romances that he loved.
Hmm.
And at one point, the sanity switch goes off. He becomes, in his mind, a knight errant. In my books, for instance, in Ad Nomad, Dane Bacchus is a guy who needs to get a job. He wants to be a creative. He wants to merge his ability to write and to create and to imagine and to come up with witty ideas with a paycheck, and so he goes into advertising. But the problem he has, of course, is that as a writer in advertising, it's kind of a corporate activity. You have to you have to accommodate yourself to the idea that that the paycheck is going to be your applause, and that your creative yayas, your creative reward is going to be that you're allowed to keep your job, and that people in the committee, in the creative, review, acknowledge that you've come up with some good ideas. In Mad Nomad, you have a young man who goes into the Peace Corps with the intention of being closer to his French girlfriend, which doesn't seem to make a whole lot of sense. But then again, when you're young and and he's also thirsty for adventure. He's thirsty to go out there in the desert and, be a swashbuckler. And of course, again, not realizing that no, he's going to have to be a teacher and he's going to have to work within a system very much like a system in the United States. In the United States, you have school systems. In Tunisia, you have a school system,
Yeah.
and you have to, toe those lines, cultural and professional. And so you see, that's where my conflicts come in. It's the individual versus the system.
Sure. I can understand that. Let's change gears a little bit here because you've written something called Spontaneous Revolution. There's one and two, and something tells me that's not about your life in any way.
No. Um,
And there's plenty of conflict in there, if I understand correctly.
Yes, and the germ for spontaneous revolution actually came to me the germ of it came while I was delivering newspapers in the morning once when I was in high school, and I just had this idea of an apocalypse in which you had the media versus the government, and you had all of these large entities colliding, but it was all really about this thirst for a Messiah or a savior. In a way, it's not so different from T.S. Eliot in The Wasteland with the Fisher
Yeah.
King and the desire. We live in a time of cynicism and spiritual aridity. People don't know where to turn, and of course, where do they always turn when they don't know where to turn? They turn to the huckster. They turn to the trickster. They turn to the person who the demonic figure. And so that was where the original idea came from. And then, of course, I wrote the first version of it in the 90s. It was prescient, I think, of where we are now, where you have these entities fighting each other. You have the media and also symbiotic, where the media tends to, tries to push people's emotional buttons so that they can sell products, they can sell advertising time to their clients. But meanwhile, they try to organize the masses, the public, to sort of watch them and believe what they're saying. And at the same time, we have the political system, the government, and the government tries to tries to manipulate the media as best they
Mhm.
can. Well, how? By giving them good stories, by
Mhm.
giving them outrageous material that the people that are going to push the buttons of the viewers. And so that was my sort of I call political science fiction, my political science fiction extrapolation of what I saw to be major schisms, major problems in our society that are never going to be resolved. They're always going to just sort of bump along. And so that was spontaneous revolution. But you have to. But really, the main character, a character named Monroe, is a sort of unwitting savior. He's really just somebody who's been, he's been tossed away because of his own political activities, and now he's been kind of brought back into society just because he fits a he fits sort of central casting's notion of what they need to
Yeah,
fill the moment.
sure.
So,
Now, because you mentioned earlier with Rocked and Rolled, and you said the same thing about Spontaneous Revolution, that you started writing it in the 90s. When did you finish? You brought it back out and you added Spontaneous Revolution 2. So when was the last time you touched on writing Spontaneous Revolution?
well, spontaneous revolution, I recommenced, if you will, in 2017. I was actually at the back end of writing my third collection of essays called Sartre in the Subway, and I wanted to get back into writing. And I was also reading Doris Lessing's mammoth book, The Golden Notebook. And so I got back into writing Spontaneous Revolution, and I realized that there were parts of it that could be amplified, that could be developed. Um, Ironically, I was also watching some television. I was watching some mini series that were interesting to me, and I thought, people today, um, they like sort of the novel has sort of crept in to television. You look at shows like Breaking Bad, The Sopranos, and a number of others, Better Call Saul, and you realize that the novel, the specificity, the depth, the characterizations, the long plot, the subplots, and the different plot lines, it seemed to me that I could amplify what I had already done with Spontaneous Revolution. I didn't have
Okay.
to cut any corners. I didn't have
Right.
to, you know, do it episodically. I could do it. I could give the full range of my imagination to this project
Right.
and see it in terms not of like little episodes, little vignettes that a person could just read in, a few
Okay.
nights or a few
Okay.
days.
All right.
I wanted to allow it to be like a complete blown out series.
This is a very different topic than when we were talking about rock and roll, and we'll get back to that briefly just
Sure,
before
it's
we end.
fine.
But
I'm
are you you're pessim or you're not a pessimist. You seem to me be a realist, but with an upbeat attitude. Am I correct?
You are a good read. You're an excellent reader of human beings. First of all, you see that I smile a lot. And
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
anybody who smiles a lot,
So
I'd have
if you're gonna write a dystopian story, is it possible to have one with a relatively happy ending?
yes, but everybody, but everything has had it's a happy ending despite a great deal of loss,
Right.
which I would hope to think is what a kind of beatific old age is like. I
Yeah.
mean,
Yeah.
we all, every there is no we nobody get, as Jim Morrison once said or sang, nobody gets out of this alive, right?
Mhm.
And
Yeah.
so there is going to be loss. There is going to be.
Sure.
It's hopeful. I guess what I am is
Yeah.
I'm more I'm hopeful, but but then again, we look. I was just I was telling my wife, we World War II. Yeah. Look, now things are looking pretty bleak, but look at World War II. 50 million people died, and yet we came out of it. So she said, yeah, but a lot of people didn't. It wasn't a
Yeah.
happy ending for a lot of people. No, it wasn't.
Yeah.
It was a bottleneck, and
Yeah.
there are always going to be evolutionary bottlenecks. COVID was another evolutionary bottleneck. And
2001. You were in New York, I take it, during the 9/11.
I was also, yes, in fact, I worked a mile away from it, and I was in the subway, and the subway was just stopped. It was just stopped for about an hour in the middle, just near Greenwich Village, near 6th Avenue and 4th Street. Finally, they discharged us from the subway without, get out of the subway, get out of the subway. And we leave the subway, and I see a herd of men and women in their Wall Street business suits just ambling up 6th Avenue, looking, and you don't see that. And then
Right.
I looked up, I looked south, John, and I saw a plume of smoke going up from one of the towers.
Yeah.
And then, of course, the other one collapsed as I was
Wow.
walking
Wow.
down toward my agency where I was working. It was and then of course I walked all the way uptown to reconnect with my wife and daughter. My wife had gone down to pick up our daughter from elementary school. It was and every time I would look down toward the World Trade Center, I felt like I was looking at an amputation. I never liked those buildings, by the way. I always thought they were ugly, ugly and big.
Mhm.
But not seeing them there, I felt I missed them terribly.
Yeah. Yeah. So,
So,
writing dystopian things are maybe a little bit closer to your heart than you think then.
oh, absolutely.
Well, let's do one last thing before we wrap this up.
Okay.
Uh, you can give me a pitch for Rocked and Rolled, and I can put you full frame, and you can tell the people your final words on that and remind them where they can get it.
Okay. Well, I'd like to tell you my name is Eric J. Sonnenschein. I'm from New York. This is my newest novel, my 10th publication, my newest novel, Rocked and Rolled. You can find it on Amazon as a paperback or ebook. Part of the theme of Rocked and Rolled is what makes us have to make music? Why do we make music? It's so tough. It's such a tough business.
Mhm.
It's so heartbreaking and backbreaking. Why? Why do you do it? Why do people have to make music? And in a larger sense, why do we have to be creative? there are so many alternatives to living, you know. We could
Hmm.
you could be a lawyer, you could be a doctor, you could sell tires, you could do anything. Why do we have to be creative and deal with all of the craziness that goes along with that? And that's it.
You're quite the storyteller, Eric. That's for sure.
Thank you very
Absolutely.
much.
And
Thanks a lot.
I wish you all the success. I'm sure that your books are fascinating to read. And you're always welcome back on this show next year, when I'm doing season 5, or if I extend it to season 6,
Oh,
we
that'd
can
be great.
yeah, we can
I,
keep
I
in touch and we can have another chat next time.
I'm working on a book now about culture, about films and art and different. These are
Good,
articles, essays. So
good.
maybe I could talk to you about those if you
Sure.
want.
Of course. Of course. You're welcome back anytime.
Thanks a lot, John.
All
I
right. Well,
appreciate
you
it. I
well you
really
take care.
enjoyed talking to you.
I enjoy hearing your stories and talking to you as well. All right. You take
Okay,
care now.
have a good evening,
Bye-bye.
a good day. Bye.
Thank you for watching. If you've enjoyed this week's episode, and if you like what I do here on Tell Me About Your Book, then I invite you to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and even leave a comment if you wish. And if you are an author, I would sure love to hear from you. Until such time, keep on writing, and remember to be kind to one another.